Okay. All right. Well, welcome, everybody. My name is Will Lucenhop. I am one of the co-chairs, along with Casey Gallimore of the Research and Evaluation Committee, and our committee, a newly formed committee that we'll talk about in just a second, the Just Medicine team, are co-sponsors today of our webinar on anti-racist research. How do we capture race and ethnic phenomena in health or healthcare research? Um, we are very lucky today to have Dr. Ali Sewell, who's Associate Professor of Sociology from Emory University in Atlanta. I'll say more about Dr. Sewell in just a second, but before we begin, just lay out a few super basic guidelines for the day, and then introduce the REC, remind everybody about the REC and the Just Medicine team. So we have so many people on today, we are only going to do questions and comments by the chat. So if everybody could stay muted, that would be helpful. When Dr. Sewell and I, we touched base yesterday, Dr. Sewell is going to present two different, essentially two smaller presentations, each about 20, 30 minutes long, and then we'll take about 10 minutes for Q&A, and then we'll go on to the next one. Dr. Oide, who is here, will be monitoring the chat along with a few of us, and we'll go to your questions at that point. I did want to remind everybody, though, in case you're unfamiliar, about the REC, which is the Research and Evaluation Committee, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Casey Gallimore at the University of Wisconsin, who's going to just remind us about the REC, and then she will hand it over to Naftali.
All right, great. Thank you, Will. As Will mentioned, he and I co-chair the Research and Evaluation Committee, also known as REC. If you're not familiar with that committee, our purpose is really to grow interest and enthusiasm around research and evaluation among CFHA members, and then also to provide opportunities for members to participate and collaborate in research and evaluation efforts really specific to integrated care. And so we accomplish that through a whole variety of initiatives and offerings throughout the year, and that includes today's webinar. So I'd really like to say thank you to Dr. Sewell for today's presentation and discussion, and then also thank the Just Medicine team for collaborating with us on putting this webinar together. And with that, I'll turn it over to Naftali to tell you a little bit more about Just Medicine.
Everyone, it's great to see you all. Great to see your wonderful faces. In fact, if you just want to have some fun with it, you can turn your cameras on and see each other in these days where we barely see other people, it seems like sometimes. And if you want to do that, turn on gallery view and you can see all of us at the same time. So great to see you all. Thank you for making this one of the best attended, highest registered events of the year. It really demonstrates the values that we have in as an organization. And you're really in for a treat. Our preliminary discussion with Dr. Sewell was just absolutely stimulating. So even if you're not into research per se, and you just tuned into this because you're really interested in trying to figure out how to be an anti-racist advocate in your work, professionally, clinically, or otherwise, you're going to get some nuggets here. You're going to get some ideas about how to think about race and ethnicity and identity in general. So this is going to be really fun. My job here is just to tell you a little bit about the Just Medicine team that's sort of co-sponsoring this event internally within CFHA. So the Just Medicine team is a new team. It works as a kind of an advisory group. And I'm going to read to you our beginning sort of charter or mission that we crafted recently as a way to invite you. If after this presentation, you really feel like as a CFHA member, I'm really interested in kind of doing something about this. I'm really interested in participating in creating a community that really espouses these principles of inclusivity, diversity, and anti-racism, then we're just going to invite you to join our group. So this is what the Just Medicine team's mission is. The Just Medicine team is a group of CFHA members tasked with assessing the Collaborative Family Healthcare Association with regard to the inclusivity and embrace of diversity broadly defined in its human resources, products, and operations. the Just Medicine team is coalesced to internally actualize CFHA's values of diversity, equity, and social justice. All right, so if that's something that you think you want to participate in, please let us know. There's a couple of ways you can get a hold of us. You can either just email our general email, info@cfha.net, and just say, hey, I'd like to be part of the Just Medicine team. Or you can email Liana Edwards, specifically ledwards@cfha.net for inclusion there. We meet, or the plan is to meet at the very least quarterly. We've actually been meeting a little bit more regularly than that. And the other cool part of this is that there's relationship with the board. So we want this to be something that cuts across all of our organization, including a board member that sits on the committee today, Stacy Obide, who will be handling the chat. Last but not least, before we get to the fun part today, if you haven't heard already, we have a conference coming up. In fact, some conference events have already started, but the main live conference is October 7th to 10th. Check it out, integratedcareconference.com. And intentionally, we have also crafted a variety of topics at this year's conference that are centered on issues of equity and anti-racism as a stance as professionals. So thank you all again. It's great to see you all. I hope to see you as our conference progresses. So without further ado, I hand it back to the folks at the REC.
Alrighty, thanks, Casey and Neftali. And again, without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Alyasah, Associate Professor of Sociology at Emory University, Director of the Race and Policing Project. And Dr. Sewell has just an immense amount of experience at the intersection of race, racial healthcare, and looking at disparities in policing and housing and policing data. And Dr. Sewell is recognized, as I was reading this, Dr. Sewell, I was like, I'm recognized by my mom, but you're recognized by the National Institutes of Health, Ford Foundation, National Science Foundation, the Society for the Study of Social Problems, the Baden-Württemberg Foundation, the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, and Planned Parenthood named you the future innovator and visionary who will transform Black communities. You've taught courses on race and ethnic relations, quantifying race and ethnicity, race and ethnic health disparities, and theories of race and racism. I imagine there is so much more there. So anyhow, we wanted to welcome you, and I'll turn the mic over to you, and we're looking forward to hear what you have to say today.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. I'm trying to make sure I have a very updated part of the PowerPoint. But thank you so much for bringing me in. I think this probably started over a very long Twitter thread about why we shouldn't consider race as a control mechanism, a control variable, I would say. We'll get to that in the second part of this conversation. I think in order for you to understand the modeling of race, you have to understand how we've actually measured race, how we've come up with this typification system. And the question is it just a typification system, which if we think about this from a census perspective, and that's kind of where our entire ideas of race gets capitalized, right? So it gets codifies into the political, the economic kind of construct of the United States by counting people, right? So what does the counting mean, right? When we put people in a box, what are we really getting at? And that's where I want to start today. So I call these conceptual issues regarding the questions of race and ethnicity. So before we measure race, we have to know what it is. And that's where we're going to start today. So supposedly, now we have 30 years from now, this is what the kind of picture of the average American will look like. And so one of the things you see is that the issue of skin color is not quite the distinction that we think about now, and that when we consider the long history of how we've counted race, we've considered this kind of binary of very dark to very light. And if you go back to our understandings of the concept of racism, W.E.B. Du Bois, who is the foremost sociologist in the study of race and ethnicity, and I would probably say the foremost thinker on issues of race and ethnicity, particularly when it comes to methodological issues, is that the problem of the color line is not just race, but it's this relationship between people who are at the end of these spectrums. there's a whole history between that, right? And the way we think about the interaction of people, and what the race category tells us is that just because of what you see here, whether it's the type of skin tone or the type of hair texture or the symmetry of the face, we can know exactly what you do. And that's kind of where we start with the problems that we have when we are trying to consider race as a mechanism, right? Or a type of way in which we denote statuses within the system. So when I think about conceptual issues, I break them down into four different things. Number one, identifying the type of race you are, the type of ethnicity you are. Within this ethnoracial milieu, which is race, ethnicity, nation, and religion, where do you fit in this space? And it could be considered a box or a continuum, but we have to understand the idea of putting people in a box or putting people in a category. Number two, once you're in a category, what is the thing that category is carrying, right? So what does it mean to have a status or an identity or classification of being in that group? And lastly, we have to consider, and I take this, I'm a medical sociologist, a social psychologist, and so I bring that perspective to understanding methodological issues. So there are different theories about what is the relationship between these typologies and all the disparities that you get from that, all the differences in outcomes that you get for that. In a health outcome, we're considering life and death, we're considering sicknesses. We can think about this from a more of a social psychological issues. We're talking about issues of culture, attitudes, and to an extent, the behaviors. And then lastly, and what I would kind of push us to move towards is these issues around systems of inequality, systems of ethnoraciality. So the reason why race is really important for, I would say, any study, some people say I can see race in anything, I can see ethnoraciality in anything, is because it is the first characteristic, one of the first characteristics besides gender that an individual will see when they're engaging in one-on-one interaction with someone. You can also consider this more broadly as you essentially being in a closed space, even though right now we have the 6 feet rule, you're still seeing people, you're still interacting with people. When you walk into the grocery store, you don't just see one person, you see a collection of people. And when you start to see them in these larger kind of racial spaces where there are people who don't look like some people and they don't look like other people and they don't look like you, right? How are you reading meaning to that differentiation, that distinction kind of continuum? The other part of thinking about this is that the meanings, right? And I call it affect, but the other way of thinking about this is just emotions, right? The feelings that we attach to these cues, whether the cues is skin color or it's hair texture or it's the kind of figure of the face, we attach a meaning to that, right? We attach meaning to that. One example I think about that is in the COVID era, there has been some criminalization of Black men in particular who are wearing masks, right? So we have to think about what does the mask itself mean before COVID, and then how does that influence how you would, in what you actually consider the mask is actually a protective gear. How then do we read what the mask is based off of the face underneath the mask, right? So adding a mask to a white face gives you a different meaning of danger and protection than adding a mask to a Black face, okay? And then the last thing, the reason why race is important is because of these issues of inequality and outcomes. I think about them as outcomes because, you know, they're things that they have to evolve. In fact, they may be achieved, right? They're not there, but then they're there. So you have to do something to get this product, this outcome, or they can be ascribed. And that's a little harder to think about with outcome spaces, because if it's ascribed, it's something that someone gave to you. So it's in the giving, right? It's either the being, the actions that we're doing to becoming something, right? Or it's the extent to which someone gives you something, right? And that's the distinction that we think about. In these giving, right, and becoming, we have these systems of inequality that will develop. And those systems themselves are imbued with the same ethnoracial cues that are present in social interactions, and those types of cues that we identify someone as belonging or not belonging, or worthy or not worthy of a job, or, you know, there's someone who we have to think about that they're just different, right? They're just different, and a different may mean that they're better for some things and not for other things. all of these are going to influence an individual's life chances and their circumstances, as well as when we start thinking about this from the group level, the entire collectivity of a group within that space over people who are not in that space. So when we think about those three things, we can actually break race, and not just race, we can break ethnicity, nation, religion into three different levels. One is the system of meaning we just talked about. Number two are the everyday social interactions. And number three are the social institutions. When we consider systems of meaning, it's the cues that I just mentioned before, right? But what do these cues mean? They're markers of classification. They're also ideologies of what race is, right? So that's kind of getting to back what I talked about with theories. Those theories of ethnoraciality, they're theories about what the cues actually mean. You also have issues around attitudes, whether they're prejudicial or pejorative. We'll kind of go into that a little bit better. Whether there are, based off of being in a category, do you think a person kind of does something, you know, versus another person? And we start to talk about these in types, right? So there's the type of who's a criminal, the type of who's a good worker, the type of someone who stands on the street in the middle of the day, that those mark different types of bodies. And so we consider those stereotypes, and stereotypes generally refer to something that is negative. We also have, remember I was telling you about going into the grocery store. If you go into a grocery store and the people are not like you, they're essentially others. We have assumptions about what those others are, what they do. And a lot of these assumptions are taken for granted. We don't think about them. We don't interrogate them. We don't ask why. We just assume that they are. Some of these taken for granted assumptions start to work in unconscious ways, meaning they're guiding your behaviors without you even really being aware of them. And then there's other ways where they're implicit, meaning they're part of the everyday interaction, and they're not necessarily ones that they're known, but they're not talked about. So one of the ways we think about that in this current, I would say, civil rights movement, the post-civil rights movement, is the ideology of colorblind. The color, we in sociology, we have a whole thing called colorblind racism, where it's this idea that people don't see color, and because they don't see color, they act in ways that essentially deny the existence of people and deny the existence of these cues, these markers that identify different types and ideologies of what race is, what ethnicity is, what nation is, and what religion is. We also have to just deal with this issue of preferences. And here we kind of think about this as in-group, out-group preferences. And those things also shape our larger understandings of who we are as a person, as well as who our group is and who other groups are. The other part of this is the issue of social institutions. And we're talking about these large social institutions like the family, healthcare. We're talking about issues of education and employment, but we're also looking at subsystems within them. So when I think about the one microcosm of a community space, a residential area, we can't just think about where the houses are, right? We have to start thinking about the collection of houses, right? What does it mean to be above the track versus below the track if we're considering places like Detroit? It also starts to think about the community center, right? Or the school that is in that community. So you start to basically break apart this entire system of the quote unquote community. And we're talking about one type of community here, right? It could be the community, could be a county, and then you start to think about the subsystems that create that overall lived experiences. We're considering the organizations and institutions. Institutions is kind of the larger, this is the public school system, the private school systems. Organizations would be the literal ex-high school, right? McNair middle school. So this is the specific place. It might be a building, it may be a virtual space where you can walk to, and that then influences what rules that you engage with people, what types of processes are considered norm, and what type of role that you take on in that space. And these social institutions, they govern the pattern, they pattern sets of norms and rules that give meaning to all systems of relationship. You know, when you're walking into a building, you walk into the bank, you say hello to the teller. When you go and say, I want to open up an account, you go and you talk to a manager. Each one of those interactions, there are things we should expect. Right? We expect a hello and a hi back, right? We may, if you're talking to a manager, you expect a handshake. So these are rules and norms that are based off of what the specific social relationship is. And then lastly, we have these everyday social interactions. And we consider them every day because, you know, a lot of times we consider is that, hey, this could happen at any moment of time, right? You know, you know, the virtual and the reality we're living right now may be that literally you turn on your computer and you go to a Zoom or you go to an online environment and you have the face-to-face interactions, or you're typing, right? You're typing, you're doing your chats. But there's some situation where you're exchanging conversation, or you're exchanging body movements between two people. And here in these interactions, we're talking about the process by which people act and react in relation to each other. And within those interactions, you can literally think about a one-to-one interaction. There's assumed that there's something that about that interaction, that there's a common set of experiences. Otherwise, why would you be in interaction with them? Even if it's you going through the airport, which I know people are not flying anymore, but say you're going to the airport and you bump into someone. What's the common experience there? Like, I don't know this person, you know, I don't wear the same clothes as they are, but at that particular time of the bump, you shared the same space. You share the same space. So it could be something as simple as that, not necessarily some of the more complicated situations, such as we have a history together. I knew who you were before you became who you are, and such and such. And all of those things, these processes, these common experiences, regardless of that's physical or social or otherwise, they're going to generate a set of reality that we all consider our own, our personal, unique space. But they also are going to influence the types of structures of social relationships that you engage into, and the way that you see the environments that you enter into. When we consider this idea of what race, and I think the idea of race, and this is kind of how it's talked about in understandings of health. I think there's a better way to think about that. I'll show it to you. That's why I use the term ethnoraciality. But when we think about what race is, we have to consider the multiple levels. And I think one of the problems, or what I would say the contradictions, or the places that are very uncomfortable for people who study health that they live in, is that race or ethnoraciality, it's at some level biological, is at some level the skin that you're in, and that same skin is what carries disease. That same skin is what is born and what dies. And so if we assume this situation where, oh, you know, race doesn't matter, and you know, the typologies and the understandings that we place on it, even if we talk about the systems of meaning, we still have to grapple with the fact that there are different types of skins, there are different types of bodies, and our job as health researchers, our job is understanding the development of the body, the mind, is dealing with the stuff that is in that becomes outward. So we have to consider this, and it ends up being a very uncomfortable place that we sit in. But the first thing that we consider here is these manifest indicators. Let's assume everything I said was true, that race is a social reality. It only comes into meaning when you're interacting with people or you're inside of an institution. It's essentially the unobserved factor. Even if we don't think about the actual body as a space, it's whatever we're considering these are conceptual understandings of race, we don't really observe them a lot of times. What we observe actually are the identities. What we observe is the skin color. What we observe is the fact that there are differences in blood pressure and that type of thing. But we can think about these indicators, these manifest indicators, as understanding two different things. One is your relationship to within this hierarchical system. This is a societal situation. And then we can think about this as what is unique to the group, and how do we just identify where the differences are. And then generally we have considered what is an IDUP, or what are the unique aspects of the group. That's culture, right? And then we think about what makes you part of a group or not a part of a group. That's ethnicity. So you have essentially some categorizations of risk behaviors for diabetes, some risk behaviors for engaging in smoking behaviors, as linked to not just the things you believe and the practice and the habits of what you do, but also just the fact that you're in these different groups, as well as that you're subjected to these larger systems of stratification. At the 1, 2, 3, 4th level, you have different types of risk exposure. Again, these risk exposures can be external, right? They have nothing to do with you. They're things that that matter. Most of those things are being controlled by other people. I consider this, for instance, We just went through a major 3 trillion or so distribution of funds for us to take care of ourselves when the economy was under siege. And so Spence, and so that's a decision that, you know, you were not part of that decision, but for many of us, we got $1,200 in the bank one day. We literally opened up the bank account and there was $1,200, and that $1,200 is going to influence how we take care of ourselves, which would then influence the extent to which we have different types of risk exposures, right? So we can't control that, but it's provided for us because of our embeddedness in this larger organizational space. On the other hand, and the kind of history of thinking about where disparities come from is the health, education, and behavior model. I think about right now, I'm thinking about Ronald Anderson, and of course, there are much more advances in health behavior theory that have happened, but the behavioral model basically says is how we show up into the healthcare environment, the clinical environment, and the types of problems we say, hey, I think I need to take a day off for this. I need a prescription for something to solve this problem. I need time to see the doctor. That entire experience is essentially asking for what we call the sick role, right? To be identified as someone who needs help. All of that is related to a set of ways we understand how we're sick, how we understand who we are, and how we understand what we want to become as far as in our body, right? The kind of ways we understand with our body, but it's also related to these issues of our quality of life, meaning our connections to other people. When we take those series of factors, what you already can see here, and this is I would say this is one of the more simple models that we can think about, but it's not simple when you start to think about all those things. And so in our model of racial differences in health, we start here, right? This late unobserved factor that we put into a box, and we get here, right? And we assume that anything else that we put into this model will explain why this late unobserved factor is related to what we actually see in the body. So when I think about what that means, the thing that's in the middle, we have to consider the macro level, the micro level, and the beneath the surface. I'm going to connect this back to what I said the kind of three functions or the three levels of race are. The macro level is these patterns, these social institutions. And I mentioned this, I gave you the example of the community. I gave you a little bit of the example of education. An easy one is right now, we're actually in an educational institution, but within an educational institution, there are many different types of roles that we have. And each of those roles, those spaces, whether it's the department or a center or being a student or a professor or a researcher, each one of those capture different institutions of norms and behaviors that gather on. When we think about interaction, it is the face-to-face, which is my primary kind of example, but it's also the stuff that we don't see. We call this the backstage. The backstage essentially is the interactions that we have with people we know, the people who we assume have a common experience. So you can think about this as either fraternity life, right? Or we can think about this as being on a sports team. That sports team, they have their own understandings of what inequality is, why we should do certain things, and why we should not do certain things about specific types of inequality. And that's a known and shared understanding. Then, right, when the fraternity for one group is talking to, for instance, they're having a party, there's other people who are not in the fraternity, then not everybody knows the same things in this space. And what we know in relationship is that there's a backstage, front stage situation where you will exchange information about who and what you think race is and what you think prejudice is and which types of stereotypes are good in the backstage that you're not going to share in the front stage. So a lot of times we see this as these videos, right? A video will come and it will say, hey, this person was using explicitive. Well, that video, when it was taken, was assumed to be among people who shared the same experience, the same values. Then when the video is released to the world, right, then that then engages a bunch of other people into that backstage reality about what the assumptions are. Then you have these attitudes, these values and beliefs. We'll talk a little bit more about specific types of attitudes and values. And then again, what I just mentioned before, which is the taken for granted assumptions. Beneath the surface is another set of things. And this is a little bit related to the backstage, front stage, but the backstage, front stage, they're still actually above the surface. You can actually see them. Maybe you can't see them if you're on one branch and the other branch, right? But they're still on the same tree, right? This is the stuff that when we're talking about differences in socioeconomic status, when we're talking about, I'm referring to here is ethnoracial differences in socioeconomic status, ethnoracial differences in voting behaviors, since that's something that's in the air right now, ethnoracial differences in whether you pay your taxes. That's what we can see. What we can't see so much, sorry, is the things that create the actual differences themselves. These roots have their own set of norms, processes, and roles around them. And a lot of times when we think about with race, we only see what we actually touch, right? There are people in this world, I am one of them. There are families that are like that, communities are like that. They live inside the ground, right? But even if you live inside the ground, let's say you dig down five feet, you're only going to see the part of the root system that is exposed. So when you consider racial differences as a root system, there's always going to be things you know and things you don't know, but the things you don't know will influence what you know, right? And what the argument around ethnoraciality is that that's a systemic conversation. There's essentially expected relationship between what we don't know and what we do know. So I want to just talk to you a little bit about typification. I won't go too far into it because I know we're kind of moving on time here. But I do want to say this about typification, which is there has never been a single way in which we identify who is in a group. The census is probably the best way to think about that. But in these different forms of understanding who's in a group, there's a really strong pull of phenotype. We assume that when we have common phenotypical characteristics that symbolize this unobserved thing that we call race, that is going to be able to predict how someone looks at themselves and how other people look at them. So one of the ways we consider this and what we start to break about, I'm going to use an example of one of a known genetic outcome. So we know this is an outcome of illness that is genetic, which is sickle cell anemia. When we look at skin color, which is supposed to be the pattern, right, by which we identify the darkness of a skin, right? This is completely geographical. There's absolutely nothing to do with even our understandings of what the 4 or 5 continents, American, European, African, and Asian. There's actually, even within these spaces, there's a lot of variation. However, by putting these individuals or putting people in these spaces according to the larger continents, and then when we consider ethnoraciality, we're essentially cutting them up by specific government or nation recognized boundaries. This does not necessarily understand what we understand about prejudice, but also when we think about even, when we know that this is a genetic kind of indicator of susceptibility, when we consider the frequency of, for instance, the sickle cell allele, it's based off of migration patterns. It's essentially, let's say it did start near the equator in a place that was concentrated near the equator. When you see the concentrations, you can literally take a map, you can take a route and walk yourself across the globe, and you'll see where you are more likely to have these frequencies. And basically, it's a linear relationship. The further out you go, the less likely you're to have it. The only kind of situation we have where we start to jump is because we have these system ways of moving people across oceans, moving people across place. So one of the kind of, I would say these kind of lay theories about why we see racial differences beside the issue of the equator is, so let's assume the equator did matter. Let's say proximity to the sun or exposure to the sun did matter. The first question is, well, now we've taken the idea of race, and it's not about the typologies we've created around it, but it's actually an issue of how certain aspects of geography are influencing what we see on the outside. So we start to get these theories about why certain bodies break down. We say, well, in some places, dark skins have a selective advantage for some diseases, whereas in other places they have an advantage for other things. So we see whether it's the different types of blood coagulation, different types of vitamin D processing, and so on and so forth. It's very difficult, however, to take these what I would consider genetic and biological understandings of what race are and pattern them on multiple types of illnesses. Maybe you can make the argument for one, but are you going to make the argument for instance, the top 10 causes of disease, which For instance, the main one is heart disease, then is diabetes, then is the lung problems, and so on and so forth, kidney, liver issues. It's hard to then take that same model of explanation and cross it or generalize it across different diseases. However, the idea of racial differences in illness is that any illness is then, you have a disadvantage in any illness based off of simply one thing. So over time, I think this is something that has fallen by the wayside. However, unfortunately, in a place like the pandemic, now we have 2.4 times increase in deaths related to COVID for Black and brown people. Those types of genetic arguments are kind of being resurfaced. So what we know is, if we think about this around the issue of variation, we're talking about here the Human Genome Project. The Human Genome Project basically found out that there's more variation within a group than between a group. And one of the ways we can see that is understanding the genetic diversity that is within a group. And a quick story here is that when you look at genetic diversity among people who are of African descent, or people who can tie their ancestral ties down to Africa, there's more variation in that group than there are among Europeans, among Asians. And what it ends up being is that essentially any type of genetic mutation or diversity that's available in Europeans is also available in Africans. And it has, again, nothing to do with this idea of race. It has to do with the idea of geography and migration.
Dr. Sewell, real quick, it's Will here. And by the way, everybody, I got permission to interrupt. We're at about 1:10. And so I'll just let you decide how you'd like to proceed. We could always try to hold all questions toward the end if you wanted to, or
I think we can go ahead and take questions. Let me.
You want me to go ahead and read out the first question in the chat?
Yep.
Okay. Let's see. So this is from Jenny Young. She says, thank you. She's a big fan of your work. It says, I'm a marriage and family therapist and I conduct research with families in genetic context. I was wondering what you thought of the recent letter in Science from Michelle Udell, hopefully I'm saying that right, and others titled NIH Must Confront the Use of Race in Science, in which they call for the elimination of the use of race as a means to classify biological diversity in both laboratory and clinical research.
So the short answer to that, there's actually two ways to think about that. One is everything I just told you, which is we have these observed characteristics that we say it's inside a category, right, that we put in a box. So most people, when they they first see a doctor, they ask you, what race are you, right? And so that's one way to think about it. The second way to think about it is actually from a research perspective. So there's a great book by Stephen Epstein that refers literally to the inclusion of race and gender in medical research. And for a very long time, there was actually no mandate to actually have diverse research populations or samples. And so you would essentially get samples for a drug, right, to identify, yes, a drug is effective. And you would only have that drug essentially tested on certain kinds of people. Most of the time it was white men for actually the majority of the history of medicine. So one is about being held accountable for our research and what our research subjects are. But the other way I think about it is actually from the perspective of a medical doctor. When a surgeon, for instance, goes into a room, all they see is a body. They see bodies, they see organs, and a lot of times they open up the body and there's a bunch of blood and there's fat and there's tissue. That's what they're focused on. The question is, what happens to them getting in that surgery, right? And then also what influences how they actually see what's in there, right? And I think one of the things we're not having a conversation with is the fact that the entire mantra of kind of pushing people into the health field is this Hippocratic oath. No matter who you are, no matter what you are and what you do, we will treat you fairly. However, you can go in and out of a doctor's office and you never even ask the question of race, or it's never even mandated. So this is a challenge, right? It's an ethical challenge in the sense of how can you not be intentional about identifying and understanding what the differences are associated with race, but then also then be sensitive, right, to the differences outside the world, whether it's class or politics or living in a certain environment that actually are patterned by race, right? And that's something that we have to move towards. We have to have that hard conversation But honestly, this is not something that's unique to medicine. So I do think in some sense, this is a conversation that needs to be from the outside in, where people on the outside are pressuring doctors to do that. And I think that very article you're talking about is a function of that outside in conversation. Now the conversation has to be from the inside out or within.
Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. We have an additional question from Maria Bermudez. Hopefully I said that correctly. Her question says, is your work also influenced by critical geography? If so, how?
So it is. The way that my work is actually influenced by critical geography is actually, I almost exclusively in my work understanding, they're called mixed effects models or nested models, where I always put people in places. I think geography is oftentimes tied to the actual land, but we can understand the idea of nesting, that people are always tied to a place regarding to any organizational unit. And in fact, the types of analytical models that you develop from understanding people's connection to place is a function of a simple saying that some people are some places and they can't be other places, right? They're not occupying one, they're not, I don't want to say, I mean, I'm more of a sci-fi fiction person. So essentially you can't have an out-of-body experience, and what you experience on one side of the wall is exactly how you're going to experience the other side of the wall. Most of the time, even we're understanding even that is clustered. When I think about the critical aspect of that, I think about the idea that when we understand what's in a place, how do we assume or theorize why the place matters? Some people say it's because we chose to be there, right? And in some sense, even choice, even the quote unquote idea of volition is patterned by the constructs or the constraints of living within a hierarchical system. But the other part of being in a place, in an organization, is what do people do to the people who are there? I think the idea of policing is a perfect example of that, right? A lot of times police come to communities, they don't live there, but they interact with the people who are there using the same cues, the same markers and meanings that are attributed to that cause labor market differences or the ability of your own vote to count. So we don't really measure that in a I would say a nested way, and at least the work that I do offers a way for us to do that.
All right. So, Dr. Sewell, we're at about 1:16. So I don't know if you want to, I'm not seeing another question immediately in the chat. I know certainly, and maybe this isn't the next segment or a whole nother talk, but given the complexity of race, the multiple layers, the social, political, economic context, everything that influences it, it does certainly beg the question, and I'm going back to the part of the question earlier. So I keep coming back to, what does it even mean when I see a basic equation in healthcare that says something about race relative to a healthcare outcome? It challenges what any of that is even meaning when that's coming up. And that's probably 5 seminars, but just
yeah. So yeah, there's 2 things I want to show. I want to show it because I think unless you see it, it's hard to. So the first thing I'm going to say is, let's think about what the function of how do we predict an outcome. Basic math is A plus B equals C, right? So when we look at the race model, race tends to be A, B is all the stuff that we think, for instance, class insurance and whatnot, and C is everything else. Around each of those measurable variables, there's error, right? And what we know from the study of race and everything I just told you as far as this system of meaning that we attribute to A is also a function of the patternings of B and C, the outcome and the things that predict the outcome. And supposedly the predictors of that outcome, racial differences in the predictors and the outcome, that then counts for everything. We assume a race effect when the things don't matter, right? When you account for all the effect of class differences on hypertension and the relationship that Black people or Latinos are more likely to have hypertension. If you remove that relationship and there's still a quote unquote difference in the outcome related to the typifications, we assume that is a race effect. And we have to consider the methodological aspects of that The first one we have to understand is the measurement problem. If we don't measure the systemic ways that we are wrong, we can't explain what the actual ceteris paribus effect of race is, meaning holding all else constant, we still see an effect. The main source of variance that we don't measure is racism itself, and that's why I want to bring this up. Let me bring this up. So this is the part where I say, you know, what does the race thing capture? We can understand that there is errors, shall we say? There's errors in what we think race is and what the kind of the way in which its relationship to the body is. But once we kind of move beyond that, we have two things that are really competing. One is the judgment of value, right? We assume that one is better than the other. That's the conversation I was referring to around the phenotypic differences. Then we assume are predictive behaviors. So this is, you know, we believe that the behaviors of people of European descent are better. They're more effective at creating a higher quality of life than the behaviors of people of African descent, Latinx and indigenous communities. So here we have this judgment of value of it is a superiority issue. It is a better, worse, but it's also a superiority issue. In these signifiers of the value, you have mostly this idea that external people identify who you are if you're in a group, and the stereotypes about the group. It is not that internal processes don't do it, but the relative weight of internal versus external leads us to more of the external part. Then we have these, when it comes to being in a group, we have stereotyping and exclusion that create some similarities. Because of that, once you start the classification process, that then coagulates the experience of that group around that stereotypes. On the other hand, we have ethnicity, and usually people do the race/ethnicity or the race-ethnicity, but the ethnicity, when we consider it more historically, it just refers to difference within a place and a time, right? Within a place or a time. So even the idea of what Black is, it really didn't exist 100 or 200 years ago. Now Black includes a lot of other categories or people of a lot of different categories that just weren't there. The entire concept of Black didn't exist. So we have to consider that, in fact, whatever group we're putting people in is a time-specific, space-specific conversation. Here, you also have a better balance between people who are inside and people who are outside in identifying what these stereotypes are and whether you're in a group. What we don't understand is that there's actually a lot of commonality between race and ethnicity, and that's what we really can understand as far as the things that explain that B, whatever that B is. That's the shared economic, social, cultural, religious characteristics. That's the extent to which these boundaries are maintained. We can think about that regarding the immigration issues we see now. That's the identification issues, right? It's not just being in a group, but do I think I'm in a group? We see this kind of clearly regarding the census in 2000, where you're now able to select multiple groups. It was probably until before 1980, it was census enumerators that identify which group you're in. So you have literally had a structural shift in what race is, the belongingness category over time. On one hand, you were identified by a person. Now you can self-identify, and now you can say, hey, I'm a part of about 5 different groups if I want to be, right? These identifications are both on perceived similarities, and these identifications are the basis for mobilization as well as the exploitation of the interests of those groups. So when I think about the entire ethno-racial category, we are talking about socially constructed categorizations of human populations. Race refers to these heritable characteristics, these various sets and skin color and behavioral types and whatnot. We have ethnicity, this shared ancestral migration histories, nation and culture. We also have nationality, which is this shared residential space and citizen rights. And we also can consider this along the idea of religion, which are the shared belief systems about the causes, natures, and purpose of the universe. If we consider all of these together, that is the system of ethnoraciality. So there's not one or the other. We consider them as a kind of, I think them as a set or a vector, different sets of vectors that come together. When we look at, in the past, we have the idea that we need to binarize based off of skin color, that supposedly there's these pure single category racial groups. So you couldn't be a slave and free at the same time, right? You couldn't be white and black, right? You're in a binarization here. And then you have this idea of the social political construct of pan-ethnic racial identities. The term Latino itself is a pan-ethnic group. Asian is a pan-ethnic group. You're pulling people from many different nations, specifically boundaries, political boundaries, but also even within these boundaries, you're dealing with different types of cultural practices and cultural identifications. And you're saying, y'all are all Asian, y'all are all Latino. The idea of the fact that we even have a Latino category, which before the 1980, it didn't exist, right? We call people Hispanic, we identified them based off of surname analysis. This is also a construction, a social political construction of a group. Now, based off of that group in the census, people can say, resources should be, taxes literally can be reallocated or redistributed along those lines. Or because I think the gerrymandering is a perfect example. If we see a concentration of people in a space, now we can elect a leader that represents all of those people. And in order to dilute the effects of that interest group, we change the boundaries around so that the vote essentially contributes to the leadership more weakly. The amorphization issue is kind of moving into what I said about ethnoraciality. These are not distinct categories. They're things that are shared, and we need to be talking about it, what is shared, and then understand why they're different. And then if we're talking about judgments of value, put in a measure of that value difference. If we're talking about time-specific and space-specific differences in how a group is categorized, put in a measure of that. Don't just assume it. And I'll kind of see this. I want to give you an example. So in 1977, we started to standardize the data collection on race and ethnicity. Before that, if you believe it, there was no standardization. An enumerator for the census could walk from one household and make a decision based off of one characteristics and then change it at the next household. And then of course, then you have to enter into that these enumerators are making, they have their own systems by themselves. So there was a statement made that whatever we're doing as far as these categories, they're developed and they represent political and social constructs, and they're used to be related to the collection of data across these major broad populations, and they're not scientifically based. They're not anthropologically based. And the fact that the government has to say that tells you something about the larger history and themes of race that are going into our population characteristics. A clean issue of this is birth certificates and death certificates. I'll end with an example of the implications of this is for our vital records. In this 1977 directive, it was 5 different categories that were said, we need to measure these all of the time. What has happened over time is there's some debates about who represents a category and how many categories you can reference. There has been a couple of different modifications since then. We have the term of Asian being specified, saying, hey, this is you have to have alignments with those people and not other people. And then the Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander designation has become a little bit more encompassing. Then you have the ability to select more races, and then you have the Latino versus Hispanic distinctions. When we look at the very first census, there wasn't even a color, right? When I say the Black versus white, you were literally slave, free Negro, and white. The idea of dentured whites wasn't even really there. We talk about indentured systems as synonymous with slave systems, but if they really were, you would be able to see something in the census to identify that. Instead, all whites have they're all in one category, and it doesn't matter about these class issues among whites. Whereas among people of African descent, we need to identify whether you are in control of your money or not in control of your money. There's no instructions about putting essentially what a color is. There were no formal schedules. And this really lasted to about the time when we first see our first World War. There was a moment here we actually identified who were Indian. That actually didn't happen until about 1870, 1880. But you also, and people don't add on this, is we also counted slaveholders. Now you can identify a slaveholder by whether they were white or whether they were free colored people, right? So that's a way that we start to think about race as not simply an artifact of the individual, but it's also a part of these meso-level institutions that we're embedded to. In this case, it would be the family. The idea of whiteness is something that has evolved across time. As there was more migration from Southern and Eastern Europe, there became a need to count ethnicity. So we have the first census in 1890 where white was not the default coding if race was not mentioned, right? So in this case, if the numerator didn't mention race or they left it blank, you just automatically assumed to be white. Instead, in 1890, you had to start to claim whiteness, right? This had to be someone to say, yes, they are white. And what you see is going into, by the time we get to the 21st century, yes, I'm writing my centuries right here. No, the 20th century, we actually see that the effects of this immigration, we actually started counting nations. There were tabulations of white bracelet broken down by whether you were an immigrant or not. And that practice did not be discontinued until basically after or during World War II. I'm not going to go into this more. I can give you the slides, but this shows that essentially, if we look at every decade of the change of the census, there's been some type of change. When you consider this at the bad level, the question becomes, how do you compare across time? How do you say that, for instance, pandemic differences in outcomes and severe outcomes are different from whatever happens in the Spanish flu? Because you don't have a consistent measure of time. And so there has to be a lot of, I would say, kind of upper level or meta level assumptions about what those differences that we see within this actually mean. A good visual here is this. You can see it from the left. We start off 1860, white, black, mulatto. This is again after, this is 5 years before the Civil War. 1850, it was literally still slave free and white. And you see every year there's a change. There's more groups created. The only group that is consistent is the group of whites. Who gets into that group is changing, but the only actual classification or typification that is consistent is white. And that tells us a lot about our stratification hierarchy and also the ways in which we hang on to these systems. Let me see where we are on time. All right, we're at 1:30. The only last thing I wanted to show you was, well, I'll show you this stuff, this one. These are birth certificates. If we didn't think race mattered, then in the county issue, there should be no change in how we measure race across time. But in fact, there was a kind of a systematic way of saying, we think a person, when they're born, is in a different racial category based off of the race of the mother and the father, right? This only becomes an issue when there's a different race between the mother and the father. Before 1989, we essentially gave the child the race well, there was a master category. So if either your mother or your father was black, you got the black category. One of the things we also don't understand is that Japanese is also a master category. So if you had a Japanese father, regardless of whether the mother was white or black, you then receive the Japanese race as a child. This is assuming, again, that a child can't occupy multiple races. After 1989, we made a formal change. Basically, the child after 1989 was the race of the mother, right? The father didn't matter at all. It didn't matter what the father's race was. If you had a black mother, you were black. Whether it's a white mother, even if you had a black father, or you were white here, and so on and so forth. And so this is we'll talk more about it. I can talk more about it at another time, but. We also right here see this system of hierarchy between race and gender come in at the very beginning of our own understandings of race. There's absolutely no way that you can talk about race if you don't talk about issues of gender, particularly when it comes to vital statistics. I'll end there.
Great, thank you. And I have a question I'll read here, and I'll just say to everybody, if you have some more questions that you would like to throw out there, please do. I'm jumping in. Stacy had to step aside for just a second. So a question that came up is, so when you're thinking about studying the effects of something like perceived discrimination, how do you distill or separate that, if you can at all, from the effects of other structural factors, such as neighborhood composition, access to resources, SES, which all again have racism and built in around them? So
So starting in the late, probably I would say 1990s, we actually started to, this move has been there for a long time, but what we didn't have were these standardized measures of capturing racism or discrimination or prejudice. And what's happened, this was actually long, at least the prejudice issue was long time identified within social science research, but you have different types of conversations between what racism is as an attitude, what racism is as a practice, and what racism is as an ideology. So here you see, for instance, this inequitable treatment. There's an assumption about inequitable treatment based off of, hey, my culture should be the main reference category. Here you start to see you need to include a specific measure of ideology. The prejudice is not prejudice. So when you think about perceived discrimination, one of the problems with those measures is that it's just, and most of them is unfair treatment. Right. And then in a separate measure, they ask you, is it unfair treatment based off of language, race, gender, class, and so on and so forth. So this is the discrimination part of that. What we know, if we really understand the discrimination part of it, is not just attitudes, it's also practices. So when we start to move into a discrimination model of race, we have to start to identify those individual practices, their lifetime treatment measures, exactly what you're saying, that if you believe that you've been discriminated by the police or school teachers, or even if you've been discriminated by a medical professional, and then those practices that are embedded in, when I went to the hospital, I didn't feel very good. That may not be a specific actor, but it is then attributed to the entire institution. So here we have to think about this issue regarding to reinforcing oppressive systems. Were the actions that were done to you, did they essentially reinforce the stratification or the hierarchies that said that my value is not as much as yours? The other way I think about it, and I think this is where we're really moving to, is understanding systems of racism. In the systems of racism, you have three different ways. One is a process. So again, you need to measure exploitation. You need to measure treatment, not just measure that in fact, there are differences in socioeconomic status. One way I think about the issues of what we're talking about, how do we codify? So for instance, how do we codify that I have less insurance than you do, or I have less money than you do? We have these measures of systemic racism where they're taking inequalities across a broad range of actors, not for the individual, but for people in the places that you're in. A place-based approach allows you to deal with these issues of oppression, of exploitation, that is not only about what I've experienced, but what people like me have experienced. And regardless of whether you know it or not, it is true that there are people who undergo discrimination and they're not aware of it. Or if they code experience it, I don't feel good, they say, well, it was for other reasons. It was my fault, it was whatever else. So they don't code it as related to race, but those things still influence the individual's actions and their quality of life. And the way you deal with that is by using measures that are not filtered in through reports of individuals. So I mean, that's kind of where I think about it, as far as how do you get at the B. What is B if you don't know what B is? If you don't collect information about income, what is it? I'll give you one specific example. In the state of Georgia, for the coronavirus pandemic, the Georgia Department of Public Health is monitoring who gets sick, if they're dying, who goes to the hospital. In this measure, the only demographic factor that's included in these registries is race, ethnicity, age, and gender. There's nothing else there. There's no income, no education. We don't even know if they're employed. We don't even know if they have health insurance. We know if they got to the hospital eventually, and we know whether they died. We don't know anything else about them. So how then do you figure out if it's class, if it's politics? You essentially have to use one variable and only one variable. It's where they live, because in these registries, they have to tell you the address. Why? Because if you actually are positive, they do contact tracing. So we include the address. And so you can use geographical data. The question before about critical geography, you can use geographical data, geospatial information to then make inferences about class. But then it's not your class. It's, well, in my Black group, people were poor, less poor. They had education, they didn't have education, and so on and so forth.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Stacy, did you want to jump in and share Jeff's post, or I can jump in real quick too?
Yes, I can do that.
Okay.
Jeffrey Ring posted a really awesome and important book. As he said, it's called Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century by Dorothy Roberts. So the link is in the chat box, so check that out. We have a question from Diana Lynn. It says, what are some ideas for applying these understandings about race and its social construction to population health programs with a mission of reducing health disparities?
Yes. So, you know, honestly, the Fatal Inventions book is really good. I would also add it along with the Medical Apartheid book by Harriet Washington. And I might even add into there's a reader by Thomas LeVice that gives you a really good understanding of where all of the fine-tuned points about where's the measurement issues. When it comes to clinical practice, there are two things that are really important. I glossed over this before. Let me make sure I can show this to you. But essentially, the difference is how do you here we go. How do you then measure what the difference actually is? Is it just, right? Is it just the identification? Is it about what these individuals, the norms and behaviors that these individuals find to be taken for granted in their communities? Is it the fact that in a particular clinical encounter across eight hours, you're going to meet people that literally come from different cultures? How do you kind of tailor your experiences with that person and your understanding of how the outside influences the inside to them? And then, so there's two ways of thinking about that. One is whether the extent to which these people who are in more subsystems, right? Not subpopulations, but they're in subsystems. Have they adopted the primary system of individuals who are considered most functional in that institution? That's acculturation. Whether it's that an individual knows what's going on, they're aware of what's going on, but it's one of many things that they use. And when you're in, is it gonna? There, I missed it. It's not in this one. So the difference here is we call it the ethic versus imic approach. And what you're seeing here is when you create measures of understanding what the culture is or what the difference is whether you're using your own understandings of difference versus their own understandings of difference. So I would say that if you're in a clinical environment, usually you're talking about you have a relationship with someone. This is not, I came in, I gave you a heartbeat check. This is, I'm trying to understand your development. You can, across those repeated interactions, understand where their reference category is, and their understandings of everything becomes coded into that. The challenge that providers have is that sometimes they believe that those behaviors that are coming from those indigenous native spaces, that they're not good, that they're not healthy. And that's the place that we have to wrestle with as therapists, because in fact, some of those things actually may be healthy for them. It may be healthy for them to say, you know what, I'm going to say, you know what, I'm going to fight back. I'm going to confront someone. Well, we have whole categories of psychiatric diseases that are essentially based off of someone acting out, right? We have to wrestle with this. Jonathan Metzl has a great book about, he calls it protest psychosis. It's essentially saying that there's an overdiagnosis of Black men, Caribbean men, into I would say schizophrenic characteristics or manic diagnoses, because they perceive this acting out as a mental disorder. They see it as a mental disorder. And if we think about very early on, some of the earliest classifications of mental disorders, drapetomania, the desire to be free, essentially running away from one's slave master, was considered a mental disorder, right? So in some sense, it's a really unfortunate understanding that the system as we are living in right now, they've coded a lot of the reactions that people have to the oppressive systems as disorders themselves, right? And I understand why, right? I understand why, but it also, I think it's as therapists, we have to take on that responsibility of being able to sort things out.
We have one question from earlier that I might have missed. So Diana, or not Diana, I'm sorry. I think it was Sarah Brislin. I think I missed your question. So I'll go ahead and ask that. It says my question is, oh, sorry, Will.
I did get
Oh,
Sarah.
you did. Oh,
I
okay.
did get Sarah's question, though, when you had stepped away.
Okay, perfect. Okay.
Dr. So I'll type this in so everybody can have it, and then I'll, it might be a while till we have you back. And I think we have a lot of people on the call who would like to take some steps forward. And one of the things I'm hearing is maybe we have a lot more tools than we think, but it's really a conceptual dilemma about where we focus some of those tools. Because as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, oh, is there a really good tool that's measuring racism? Is there a really good tool? So that's my general question. It sounds like we probably have a lot of tools, but where we direct that attention is the key issue, or how we can. And maybe there's another example you could throw out of a study or something you've seen, or that accounts for some of these things you're speaking to.
I would say that when it comes to the measurement of discrimination and racism, by far the best scholar to look at in this specific paper is in 1997. Essentially, it's the first paper, I would say, that measured explicitly racial discrimination. It unfortunately assumes the name of perceived discrimination or perceived racism, and that comes from a battle. It literally comes from a battle between social scientists, methodologists who call themselves methodologists, and methodologists who don't call themselves methodologists, and saying, what is this construct? Unequitable treatment, unfair treatment, right? How do we measure it? There's a whole host, literally a whole host of measures of standard of culture, of tools that have been created for this. But the one that has had the furthest reach, and I would say would be the most valid and reliable, is an everyday discrimination skills by David Williams. I would also say Robert Taylor is in this. Ronald Anderson is here too. I'm thinking the Kessler, Richard Kessler is in here too. So I think if you want to just have that measure, right? But we also have had other types of ways. We have measures of post-traumatic slave syndrome. We have measures of identification with our own racial group. There is tons of measures that are out there. But I would say if you're really interested in the issue of unfair treatment, the best one would be David Williams's everyday discrimination skill and lifetime experiences of discrimination. Because I know that there's a kind of maybe a timeline issue here. I would say when it comes to these methodological issues, you have to collect data is one thing, but once you have the data, the question is what do you do with the data? And one of the things I argue for, and many people are with me in this one, is the use of these interaction terms and what do they actually mean? What an interaction term is says that, let's say class does matter, but how class matters, okay, let's say there are differences in income, but the question is whether income actually has the same effect on whether you die from hypertension as it does for whites. I know at least there's many different examples of this, but I use coronavirus as a very recent experience. It is true that Blacks and Latinos have more diabetes, or more likely to be diagnosed with diabetes, but the relationship of diabetes, the return, unfortunately, of diabetes on deaths for COVID is weaker for Blacks, right? So when you're developing intervention model, most people will say, oh, we need to reduce the amount of diabetes in the population. You do, okay? Everybody wants a higher quality of life. No one wants to lose a leg because of gangrene and whatnot. People don't want to have to live, for instance, on a respirator. They want less of these problems, but you also have to have the question, is this a strong predictor of whether they die from something? And when I look at this weaker effect of diabetes on COVID deaths, and the fact that one of the strongest reasons for understanding what diabetes is food behaviors, right? It is eating, it is exercise. You're essentially saying you can solve COVID by eating better and exercising more, right? On the other hand, a stronger effect of COVID comes from heart disease, right? And if we understand the impact of COVID on the functioning of the lungs, the first thing that essentially COVID shuts down is not the lungs of the heart, is the heart. It removes the ability, or it lessens the ability of blood flow. There's not as much oxygen being able to get into the blood. And in that, essentially multi-system failure begins there. So if I was trying to help someone survive COVID, Because let's assume all of us are going to get COVID one day, but we're not all going to die of COVID. If I want to say, hey, I want you to live an extra 3 years before you die of COVID, before you have to die, and I don't want you to die of COVID, I'm not telling them to eat better, and I'm not telling them to starve. I'm telling them, hey, let's do things that influence your experience of nervousness, right? Your experience of feeling like you're out of control with your behaviors. Because a lot of times the problem with heart disease is not that you are stressed out, is that you can't control your levels. And that comes from these repeated interactions with unfair treatment systems, with specific indication of discrimination where, listen, this can happen. You can walk out your room every day and it can happen. Not being able to control your environment in that way, that has an immediate impact on heart disease, right? And that has a stronger impact on COVID risk deaths than all the things that we tend to blame health problems or mortality risk, or higher mortality risk for Blacks and Latinos and Indigenous populations as well.
We have an additional question in the chat box. It says, do we need to change how we collect race and ethnicity?
Well, so a lot of my conversation about the census, that's where it is. We do. The question is this at an individual level or not? I don't think this is at an individual level. I think you have to make those decisions at these broader institutional and organizational levels. I'm just realizing that we end at 2 o'clock. So I'm like, I'm gonna cut my presentation short because I was like, oh, we're out of time. I like the question and answer part of this. This is one of the reasons why we need a standardized procedure for collecting data, right, across the country in the census, is because if we don't have the same way of measuring it, we can't do any comparisons. The second part of this, remember I mentioned the Steve Epstein book, was we need to have a standard procedures for counting race in our medical records. From Blue Cross Blue Shield to Anthem is not the same, right? And there's no mandate from the government for it to be the same. There's a mandate for the census. There's a mandate for vital records and for birth records, for birth records and death records, but there's a whole life in between them, whether you live 5 years or you live 80, right? And in that 5 years, or in those 80 years, you can have contact with institution every year, and those institutions don't measure race the same. So someone who looks Black in 1 year becomes Latino in the other year, becomes Black again, 5 years later becomes Latino. It has nothing to do with whether they're Black or Latino. They are not changing let's assume they're not changing their identification. It's because they're going into, the school says it has a master category of Latino. The doctors have a master category of race, of Black, right? So you have to have a systemization within these organizations, not just at the top level. The last thing I'll say is this, I know again, very uncomfortable, but I do think we have to mandate collection. So, maybe I'm just giving my own personal experience. Not personal, I'm part of a team with the Rollins School of Public Health in conjunction with the Department of Public Health. And I lead the structural inequities team, which essentially says, does class matter? Does politics matter? Does education matter? And we don't have these measures for it. Unfortunately, in Georgia, and this is the case with many states, 35% of the sample of people we know have COVID, there is no race data. You don't know if they're white, Black, or in between. Across the nation, there's a tracker, it's called the Racial Tracker for COVID. It's out of Boston. Ibram Kendi runs it. Overall, on average across the 50 states and the territories, it's about 25 to 30%. There are some states where it's about 40 to 45%. States like, for instance, Maine is really good, where it actually collect race on everybody. But the fact that you have, in a state where you've seen sharp racial differences in risk in COVID deaths is actually stronger in Georgia than it is for the nation overall. You're not collecting race at all, or for many people. Here's a question about this. What do you think the racial characteristics of those 35% of people are? We want to assume that it's the same as the distribution of people who we do collect race from. I might suggest that it's not, right? We have, within the state of Georgia, there are certain counties that didn't start collecting race until May 1st. And there are other counties that from the beginning, December 1st, January 1st, they were collecting race. Then across those counties, we have different systems, right? So while the mandate the mandate for collecting race against those 5 categories within those ethnic distinctions is at the federal level, it's not necessarily at the state level. And it's definitely not necessarily at the municipal or county level. So we need to have, I'm saying, you know, I want doctors and insurance companies to take on that responsibility of counting race and adopting these standardized measures. But in the end, we have to make these policies from the top down, right? So that no one can make an excuse, well, I wasn't in the state or I was da-da-da. Because let's say someone moves, if they move city to city or county to county or state to state, now you're subjected to the same problem I had, not across institutions because I went to school in this district and I went to the healthcare in one system, but because you just moved, right? Just because you were on vacation and you got sick, now you're subject, your medical treatment and your records are subject to Florida state's laws or guidelines, and they're not based off of your own state. We have to consider that, and that's a political. I don't want to call it a political problem. I think it's a policy issue. It would be nice again if it was mandated for every healthcare system that creates medical records or contributes to medical records does it the same way using the same guidelines, right? Unfortunately, however, even when we think about the issue of race and ethnicity, number one, is not mandated to collect, is often not mandated to collect ethnicity. Also, you have the situation of which one becomes more prominent. Right now in our census, census then creates a mandate for vital statistics, which then is used by other places. There are different dimensions. Is race, is ethnicity, is 2 different questions. The proposal for the 2020 census, which did not go through, unfortunately, was we have one question. And the question includes 2 things. It has the master categories, the five ones. It also has a 6th one for Latino. And then you can choose multiple groups and you can write in for a specific group. So you have full range as an individual, but also you have full range as a provider, right? You don't have to make that hard choice on your own. And you also don't have to make your own decision about what matters more.
I'm thinking, you know, it might be a good time with just our couple minutes left to wrap up here. I don't know if you could in about 30 seconds or in 1 minute or so, if there was a teaser for a next session, what's in that next session? I mean, and granted, let's say there really should be 30 next sessions, but
we'll try to do it too. I really, okay. My 30 seconds is I will teach you on how to use mixed effects and nested models, not just in analytically, because there's things, run your SAS or your SPSS, but how to think about them in practice, right? If you believe that people are nested in any organization, what do you need to do, and how do you use information that you have, as well as, and this is really, really important, how do you account for error, right? Error is the stuff either we don't measure, we measure wrong, right? Or we measure inefficiently, right? So I love when we started counting discrimination measures, I was like, oh, this is radical. This is so much opportunity. And I look at the measure, I'm like, there's so much stuff that's not in there, right? So you can have that measure, and then there's stuff that it's there are ways in which you're not actually understanding difference. My quick pitch here is the issue of gender and sexuality is probably the primary way we can consider this, the moving forward. We used to just put people in a category, you're based off of sex organs, frankly. Now we actually ask them who they may have relationships with. And if we understand the transformations around in the queer community, the dimensions of race, of gender and sexuality, it's more than 2, it's more than 3, it's more than 4. So then how do you set up a way to organize, right, the information you have? How do you find a way to ask the questions about what you do, you can? And the reality is you only have 25 minutes for this person to do the survey. you just can't ask them everything. And what I would suggest at that point in time is you use these organizational characteristics to get a better sense of where the error is, and also eventually to reduce invalidity and unreliability.
All right. Well, I can't wait for that next session. I know I'm speaking for everybody when I say thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your thoughts with us. I know I'm going to go back and watch this probably 4 or 5 times. I'm going to make my students watch this. I'm going to make my colleagues watch this. And we so appreciate it. And we wish you the best. Look forward to hearing from you again. And my shout out to everybody who's still here. If you have a question or an angle you just want to throw in the chat for us to hold on to for later, please share that. Otherwise, we will wrap up there. And thank you so much.
Thank you. I can stick around. I mean, you can. Yeah. If I was actually there, someone would stick around and ask me some questions, so I can stick around there.
Yeah, great. Yeah, if anybody who's still left would like to ask a question, feel free. I like that background you have. That I got to go to Ireland, and there's where the Book of Kells is in a library that literally looks just like that. I thought it was in Harry Potter.
Something, a little more pizzazz in it.
Yeah. I was looking at your courses. Have you ever thought about doing one of those? I think they're called. What is the name of those giant courses people do? It's like MOOCs or.
Oh yeah, the MOOCs. Yeah, I mean, I think eventually we're going to move towards that, because I mean, at least at Emory, one of the challenges has been, we're a small university. I mean, we're a big university, but our classrooms are really small, and we only have about 7,000 kids at undergraduate. Yeah. So we have really good teachers. The question is, how do you get that information beyond the walls? And that's the way to do it. The virtual environment is perfect for that. So I know we're already kind of putting that into our space. And for the classes I teach, not everybody studies this stuff, but it has implications for a lot of different places. So instead of it being a departmental class, it's a university class, or it's something that we can teach in a winter session or a summer session that you can come in there for four days and get this information. Again, I think the virtual environment makes that far more accessible, because people, they have 8 to 5s, but now 8 to 5 is probably a little more fuzzy than it used to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody who's hanging out? Question, thoughts, reflections? Okay. Oh, maybe one here from Nyan. Nyan's trying to battle those pumpkins in the background.
I am. No, I wanted to say thank you. I think, so I'm actually in a class right now on cultural competency and respect, but you took it from an angle that I haven't heard before, really going through the history of where color came from and how it does impact everything. And so it was a completely new perspective, and I wanted to say thank you, and just a sign of appreciation for that.
Yeah, my pitch here is, I think if you don't understand kind of where it comes from, it's hard to make a decision one-on-one about what's important. You end up having to you have to say, okay, this is what is for me, or also this is what seems to be important for the other person. By creating, based off of these historical constructs, by creating a single platform, then you don't have to make that decision, right? You can still do the interpretive frameworks that you use, regardless of which discipline it comes from, but at least you have a single space in which, well, maybe this is what you can do and maybe what you can't do. That sounds really scary for a lot of doctors, because you don't want to create a normative body. You don't want to create a normative identity. And all that is true, except that if you want to understand and close the gap on whether people live or die at certain points of time and live good lives, you have to know who they are. So we have to just walk towards, without really any apologies or kind of tetherings, and say, we're going to do this, but this is how we're going to use the information, and this is how we're going to interpret the information. We have to remove this genetic, just my personal opinion, I think this is one that's shared. The Fatal Interventions book is a perfect examination of that. We have to remove these genetic lay theories of why things matter. We even have to remove these biological theories of why there are racial differences. We have to, right? Because otherwise all this diversity that's inside of us becomes about race and not about the other things that are influencing why poverty has an impact one time and it doesn't have an impact the other time.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Dr. Sewell, thank you. Just so awesome. And I'll tell you, we always do, we'll do a little debrief. Of course it went great, but we'll follow up, share any thoughts we have. And again, my hope is we get to have you back and hear part 2. And I'll continue following your tweets, which my wife has pushed me onto Twitter. It's kind of fun. So it's like a whole new world. Academic Twitter and all that. It's new stuff. So anyhow.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. It's been great.
Okay. Have a great day. Thank you. Take care.